Welcome to the committee's 8th hearing of the 118th Congress about drug development for rare and serious diseases. As is the tradition of the committee, the Aging Committee Ranking Member Braun in this case, will offer an opening statement.
Thank you, Senator. Thank the witnesses for coming and for all the folks from around the country here today. There are over 7,000 rare, progressive, and serious diseases known to man. It's estimated that 95% lack treatment. Yet in my time as senator, there's not been one Senate hearing to examine promising therapies for people with rare, progressive, and serious diseases. The room is packed with people, patients, and caregivers that live this reality every single day. Right here, 350 patient stories from 44 states. This is long overdue. People that watch their bodies deteriorate in real time. Family members who have seen their loved one go from the picture of health to knocking on death's door. Parents that buried their children before they even started school. I want to recognize and thank each one of you that are here in the audience and let you know I think this is the beginning of a new day for what we're all interested in. Chairman Casey, in response to this hearing, our committee has received these letters, 350 of them, 44 states, with personal experiences. I ask by unanimous consent that we enter these into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. A wide variety of disease groups are represented in these submissions, including ALS, DIPG, an extremely aggressive pediatric cancer, and Barth syndrome, an ultra-rare genetic disorder that regularly results in death from heart failure before a child's 5th birthday. Importantly, none of the diseases that our constituents have contacted us about have any form of FDA approval treatment, not one of them. These diseases are relentless, they're widespread and devastating. Most are considered a death sentence, but they are not invincible, and our constituents are not helpless. Patients deserve a promising pathway at the FDA. Today, I'm joined by Senators Gillibrand, Wicker, Kramer, Murkowski, Manchin, and Warnock in sponsoring the Promising Pathway Act to create a more flexible, accessible, and compassionate drug approval system at the FDA. And if there's any indication from the over hour and a half I spent on the Senate floor yesterday, we're going to be getting a lot more senators on this bill. The Promising Pathway Act would create a rolling, real-time drug approval pathway to speed access for individuals with these rare diseases. This bill does not undermine patient safety or FDA's gold standard for drug approvals in any way. Therapies developed through the pathway will be rigorously evaluated and continuously studied using real-world data. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter of support for this hearing signed by 15 individuals and organizations.
Without objection.
The Promising Pathway Act is a common sense step to give the FDA the flexibility it needs to serve Americans with these most trying diseases. Our constituents continue to fight for new treatments, greater access, and full lives. I ask my colleagues to join me in unlocking hope for these constituents. I yield back to you, Senator Casey.
I want to thank Ranking Member Braun. Of course, he worked to put this hearing together, and his staff and our staff, and I'm grateful for your work on this. This is a topic that's obviously meaningful to everyone in this room and every member of the committee, and we look forward to a robust discussion about this topic today. As Ranking Member Braun outlined, rare diseases are those that affect some 200,000 Americans and over 7,000 rare diseases have been identified. 7,000. While each individual rare disease may affect only a small number of people, collectively, it's estimated that some 25 to 30 million Americans are living with a rare disease. We've done a lot of research into and drug development for these rare diseases. In 1983, prior to the passage of the Orphan Drug Act, there were just 38 drugs approved to treat rare diseases. In the 40 years since, we have over 1,100 new drugs or new indications for drugs approved for rare diseases. I'm proud to have worked on legislation entitled the Creating Hope Act to incentivize the development of drugs for rare pediatric diseases in particular, and other legislation to address some of the challenges faced by those living with what you might call ultra-rare diseases, which affect even a smaller number of people. My legislation, the Creating Hope Act, captures what we as legislators are trying to do, to give Americans living with rare diseases hope for the future. And while we've made some progress, many challenges remain, as we'll hear from our witnesses today. Too many people living with and dying from rare diseases still do not have FDA-approved therapies to treat or mitigate their conditions. I believe that every one of these individuals deserves access to an FDA-approved, safe, and effective therapy. So we must make sure that research continues and that clinical trials are designed to allow effective therapies to reach patients as quickly as possible. Rare diseases and the research and clinical trials for drugs to treat them are fundamentally different from more common conditions. We'll explore some of those differences today and the ways in which they present challenges for drug development through our witnesses and their testimony today. It's important to note that my observations on the challenges facing the rare disease community and the steps we might consider to address these challenges don't necessarily apply to other non-rare conditions. But as we'll hear today, the challenges for drug development start from the earliest stages of development. When patient populations are small, it's hard for clinicians and researchers to develop what is known as a, quote, natural history, unquote, for the disease, and what the trajectory of the disease is when it is not treated. Natural histories are important for developing therapies because if you don't understand how a disease progresses, it's hard to measure whether a new therapy is working. Rare diseases often are heterogeneous, meaning that not every patient disease will progress in the same way, compounding the problem of poorly understood natural histories. Once a promising drug candidate makes it to clinical trials, there are further challenges. Drugs intended to treat common conditions are tested in hundreds of thousands of people. When your entire patient population is only a few thousand or a few hundred or a few dozen, it's simply not possible to do the same type of clinical trials. And when you have smaller trials, it's more difficult to demonstrate efficacy. In recent years, the FDA has taken action to improve how it works with companies developing drugs for rare and serious conditions. And the agency has done a lot more work to hear directly from patients affected. More recently, the FDA has announced new initiatives specifically aimed at supporting drug development for rare diseases, such as the Support for Clinical Trials Advancing Rare Diseases Therapeutics, or START, the acronym START, S-T-A-R-T. This is a pilot program to enable real-time communication between a drug sponsor and the FDA staff on these development issues. Another important initiative of the FDA is the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement pilot program to support drug sponsors' ability to engage with the FDA around the development of so-called endpoints, the metrics of efficacy for drugs for rare diseases. In the last decade, the FDA has also done more to hear directly from patients with patient-focused drug development. These are meetings that give the FDA staff the opportunity to hear directly from patients about how their disease affects them and what drug effects are meaningful to them in their daily lives. So I support the agency's recent steps, but we should continue supporting and strengthening their authorities and to do more to facilitate more approvals of safe and effective drugs. So I look forward to hearing today's recommendations from our witnesses about the steps we can take to lead to more FDA-approved treatments for rare diseases. So next, we'll move to our witness introductions. I'm pleased to turn to our first witness. Our first two witnesses, I should say, will be sharing their experiences as patients and advocates, but in this case, they will not be answering questions. They'll be providing opening remarks virtually. And for our first virtual witness, I'm glad to turn to Ranking Member Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My pleasure to introduce Brian Wallach. From the time that Chris Coons and I formed the ALS caucus here in the Senate, which has been an active one, gotten to know Brian well over that time. Really needs no introduction. He is a true change maker and champion. Brian has a storied career as a regional campaign director and White House counsel for President Obama. He later became a federal prosecutor in Chicago. His life took a turn in November 2017 when he was diagnosed with ALS and given 6 months to live at the age of 37. Rather than accepting the status quo, he decided to fight. Along with his wife, Sandra, Brian co-founded I Am ALS, a nonprofit dedicated to cure ALS. Brian is the father of 2 young girls. Thank you for being with us here today, Brian.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun. Now I will read an introduction from my colleague, Senator Durbin, a senior senator from Illinois. Quote, I'm so pleased that the Senate Aging Committee will be hearing from my constituent, Brian Wallach, this morning, and I want to thank the chairman for affording me the opportunity to share a few words about Brian. One of the truly wonderful things about being a United States Senator is that the people you get to meet along the way. People like Brian and his wonderful wife, Sandra. 6 years ago, on the day they should have been focused solely on bringing their newborn second daughter home for the first time, this young family was confronted with an unimaginable diagnosis. Brian had ALS, a disease for which there is no cure and which, as of now, is fatal 100% of the time. Brian and Sandra quickly turned their grief into action, starting I Am ALS and galvanizing the ALS community around advocating for increased attention, research, and results for all ALS patients and their families. And boy, have they had success. Brian and Sandra have been the driving forces behind getting Act for ALS signed into law, ensuring Congress twice doubled the Department of Defense's ALS research budget, eliminating the 5-month waiting period for ALS patients to get Social Security disability benefits, and working with the Food and Drug Administration to finally get several new ALS treatments on the market for the first time in years. And they're not done yet. I hope the Aging Committee is as inspired by Brian as I am, as I always am, and I look forward to hearing his recommendations for how we can continue to utilize the patient voice to make progress for ALS families, unquote. That's a statement from Senator Dick Durbin. Our second witness, Maureen Bell, is from Chalfont, Pennsylvania. Maureen was diagnosed with a classic I'm going to make sure I pronounce this right, galactosemia, 7 days after her birth in 1972. Ms. Bell has experienced many of the challenges of those living with the disease have. She's an advocate for those living with this disease and a helpful resource for new patients with their newly diagnosed children. Thank you, Maureen, for sharing your experiences and your story with us. Now I'll turn to Ranking Member Braun for 2 witness introductions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My pleasure to introduce Dr. Peggy Plews-Ogan. She's a Brody Professor of Medicine at the University of Virginia Hospital. Peggy attended Harvard Medical School and completed residency at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. In December of 21, Peggy's husband, James, was diagnosed with ALS. She has since become a caregiver and an advocate with I Am ALS. Peggy and her husband have 2 children. Peggy, thank you for agreeing to testify, and James, thank you for being here today. Next witness, Dr. Anish Bhatnagar is the Chief Executive Officer of Soleno Therapeutics, which is a small biotech firm dedicated to treating rare genetic disorders. He has been with Soleno since 2006. He is a physician with over 20 years of experience in developing biologics, drug-device combinations, and diagnostics, as well as therapeutic medical devices. Thank you for being here today, and I'll turn to Senator Vance to introduce the next witness.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun, and thanks to the chairman for hosting this important discussion. As Senator for Ohio, I'm proud to introduce a great Ohio and a great Cincinnatian, Mr. Keith Testerick. Keith is the chairman and co-founder of the Cure Starts Now Foundation, which is the leading international charity dedicated to finding cures for the rare pediatric brain cancers that may help cure other types of cancers. He is also the president of the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium Foundation. He and his wife, Brooke, established their foundation in 2007 after losing their daughter to a cancer called DIPG at the age of 7. Her public battle was memorialized in the best-selling book Notes Left Behind, which was eventually translated into 22 languages. Since then, the Cure Starts Now Foundation has invested more than $30 million in over 130 trials across 17 countries. Keith helped create an innovative, organic, and linked registry that has become a model for other disease registries, and he's advocating today on behalf of public policy facilitating his important work rather than making it harder. Keith is also a steering committee member of the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium, the premier NIH-funded brain cancer research initiative. Thanks, Keith, for being with us today.
Thank you, Senator Vance. Now I'll introduce our sixth and final witness, Holly Fernandez-Lynch. She's from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I should say works in Philadelphia, but lives in Swarthmore, Delaware County, correct? Professor Fernandez-Lynch is Assistant Professor of Medical Ethics in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. A lawyer and bioethicist by training, Professor Fernandez-Lynch's scholarly work focuses on the Food and Drug Administration pharmaceutical policy, access to investigational medicines outside of clinical trials, and clinical research ethics. Thank you, Professor, for sharing your expertise with us today. And so we'll start with our first witness, Brian Wallach, and Maureen Bell will follow him. Mr. Wallach, you may begin.
Chairman Casey and Ranking Member Braun, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Brian Wallach. I have been living with ALS for 6 years. ALS has changed every part of me. My legs no longer work. My arms no longer work. ALS has almost taken away my voice as well, which is why my amazing wife, Sandra Abravaya, is reading this testimony. ALS is a disease that is 160 years old. Let me repeat that. For 160 years, ALS has killed literally everyone diagnosed with it. Everyone. That is simply unacceptable. Today, we hope to reform the FDA's approach to diseases like ALS. Under current FDA standards, it can take 15 years or more for effective drugs to move from preclinical work to approval. In the meantime, many people have rapidly progressive terminal conditions, including ALS, die, and have no viable treatments or options or hope available to them. One of the lessons from the Neuron AdCom is that there is, in fact, no such thing as a so-called gold standard across the FDA for how to approve new treatments for rare or fatal diseases. Instead, today's reality is that whether a treatment will be approved or not depends on what FDA center it is in and on the specific individuals in the FDA review team assigned to a treatment. A second lesson is that the existence of the 2019 FDA guidance is simply not enough to ensure uniform approval standards of new treatments for ALS. We very, very unfortunately learned this lesson the hard way just a few weeks ago during the AdCom for Neurone, when the question presented to the AdCom did not incorporate the FDA's own 2019 guidance about regulatory flexibility. The primary question put before the AdCom was, do the data presented demonstrate substantial evidence of effectiveness for treatment of mild to moderate ALS? This question did not at all make reference to the 2019 FDA guidance that stated, quote, when making regulatory decisions about drugs to treat ALS, FDA will consider 1, patient tolerance for risk, 2, the serious and life-threatening nature of the condition, and 3, also within the context of statutory requirements for safety and efficacy. And this is exactly why legislation such as the Promising Pathways Act is absolutely critical for people living with ALS. There is no FDA-approved biomarker for 95% of us living with ALS. What is the result of that? The result is that treatments for 95% of people living with ALS, including Brian, do not qualify for accelerated approval. The Promising Pathways Act addresses this issue by creating provisional approval. The Promising Pathways Act is also building the infrastructure to require drug sponsors to move faster in conducting their phase 3 trial and giving the FDA the authority to remove provisional approval if additional data makes clear that that is merited. We support efforts to bring safe, promising therapies to more people living with terminal diagnosis pending full FDA approval. We also support efforts to increase spending on research into the causes of ALS and potential treatments. But we do not support saying to this generation, thank you for your contribution to research. Now go home and prepare to die. While academics and bioethicists may have the luxury of debating theoretically what might look like some perfect system, us, people living with ALS today, whose lives are literally on the line, we do not have that luxury. And we are looking to you to provide them with the hope that they can live a little bit longer and maybe even be here to see a cure for ALS. The key here is that PPA approval is merely provisional. It affords early access to promising drugs to people with extremely serious conditions who are willing to take risks. It allows additional evidence about a drug's efficacy to be collected during the short 2-year provisional approval windows. Provisional approval can occur only if a drug has been shown to be safe, and required patient registries enable much broader data collection about a drug's efficacy and safety than can even occur in traditional clinical trials. This data will help the FDA make even better decisions when it comes to the approval and labeling of new treatments. Moreover, drug sponsors presumably want to obtain full approval of any provisionally approved drug. Other than allowing the use of real-world evidence to supplement an application, the PPA does not alter the current FDA standards for full drug approval in any way. The ALS story is slowly changing with measures such as the PPA, we can make faster changes needed to finally get treatments to the community that will allow people such as myself to live longer and to potentially be around to see ALS transform from fatal to chronic. I want to take a moment to recognize the caregivers and the people living with ALS in this hearing room today. We represent the 30,000 Americans living with ALS right now. I hope you or your staff will take the time to hear their stories and why they believe in the need for a Promising Pathways Act. I also want to recognize Dr. Peggy Plews-Ogan, who is before you as a witness and who has been living and breathing ALS and the PPA for the last year and a half. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this discussion. And thank you for understanding how important the Promising Pathways Act is.
I want to thank Brian and Sandra for their testimony, for being with us today. Now we'll hear from Maureen Bell.
My name is Maureen Bell. I'm 51 years of age and I live in Chalfont, Pennsylvania. I have lived with galactosemia for my entire life. Shortly after my birth in 1972, I began to show the classic hallmark signs of failure to thrive: jaundice, repeated vomiting, and weight loss. 7 days later, I was diagnosed by an intern as having classic galactosemia. I remained in the hospital for 3 weeks. My mom and dad were given a 32-page booklet entitled A Parent's Guide to a Galactose-Restricted Diet. They were instructed to follow this booklet as I would need to be on a lactose-free, dairy-free diet for the rest of my life. That was the only treatment for galactosemia in 1972. I doubt my parents knew that many more challenges would lie ahead following the years to come than just having me follow a dairy-free diet. It seemed that everything was working fine for me at the time, but I was getting older and it made me feel very left out when I could not eat the same foods as my peers. Without modern day advances we have today in nutrition, I cannot tell you how isolating it was for me. There were many social events that I could not attend. My mom tried so hard, always sending me to parties with a special treat, not just for me, but enough for everyone, so I was able to share. Not being able to eat the same cake that everyone else was eating at the birthday party was very difficult as a child. I also could not process information the same way. I always was a low average student, and math was my most difficult subject, and still is today. I struggle with making change, leaving tips at a restaurant, and figuring out percentage. I cannot process it. Basic life circumstances became a struggle, and only when I met other people living with galactosemia did I realize that comprehension issues were similar for all of us. Just as I was slow academically, I was also slow in developing physically. While my friends were going through puberty, I was not having any issues of this. No normal signs of puberty, were nothing like late development, and I still looked like I was in grade school physically as opposed to being in high school. This continued, and the sense of isolation also continued. I began to have unusual symptoms such as hot flashes, night sweats, and mood swings. After about a year of experiencing these symptoms and having blood work, I was diagnosed at the age of 18 as having premature ovarian insufficiency, which is a direct result of having galactosemia in female patients. This is something that I continue to struggle with today. As a result of this diagnosis, I became very reclusive. I wanted no part in dating or socializing like any other 18-year-old would. That was the impact of POI, premature ovarian insufficiency. Secondary to having galactosemia, this was very difficult in my 20s. I just wanted to be like any other woman at my age, socializing and having fun. However, I was depressed and had a very difficult time making friends and meeting new people. There were nights that I cried myself to sleep. At a church event in 1999, I met a man named Bill who showed interest in me and started spending time with him. I was very apprehensive about getting involved in a relationship, even though I was 26 years old. The fear of falling for someone only to have to tell him that I was infertile and taking a chance on losing this relationship weighed on me very heavy. However, I finally got the nerve up to tell him. Bill is a pharmacist, and his response was priceless, not caring about my diagnosis and instead advising me to take my calcium because I was such a slacker at taking my calcium. What a huge weight what that was lifted off my shoulders. And we recently celebrated our 23rd wedding anniversary. I was told that having galactosemia is like looking through a window at everyone at a party and they're eating all kinds of foods that I cannot have. I could see them through the window and through the glass, but could not break it or join them. The same is true for infertility. I can see moms, I can see children and families, but I cannot break the glass. This experience, I cannot break the glass, but cannot experience what it is truly like to be a mom. All my life, I've longed to be on the other side of that window. There could finally be a treatment for people like me. And even though it's too late for me, for younger ones living the way I grew up, I spoke at the patient-focused drug development meeting, but our community never heard from FDA after that. They had no questions, no clarification, and that made us worry. They had not taken the time to learn from our work before reviewing a drug. Will they understand that speech issues don't matter to us the same way as cognition and development delays do? Some of us even have more scary symptoms than the ones that I have mentioned, like seizures, kidney issues, tremors, cataracts, neurological impairments, and intellectual impairments. Will they understand that if they ask for another trial, rare diseases often don't have enough patients for another trial? Will they understand that if the drug is approved for something else rare, our doctors have seen the improvements in our community and will want to prescribe it for us too? The drug is already being studied in other rare diseases. Whether it is government insurance or through my job, insurance companies don't treat rare diseases like cancer. So that is a whole other hurdle. These days, we must fight for approval, but also fight insurance too. The Galactosemia Foundation is working hard on both things, and I hope you can help us all. I'm learning about what places like FDA and CMS and Congress can mean to me and the others whose lives are impacted by diseases like galactosemia. I don't pretend to understand, but I know even one person can make a difference. And I want to help the little girls with galactosemia going through isolation, the puberty, depression, and fear, the inability to understand and process. If all of you can take my story and help them, it will mean so much. Thank you.
Well, Ms. Bell, thank you for your testimony and for sharing your personal experiences with galactosemia, and we're grateful you're able to spend this time, and I hope you can listen to the whole hearing. We'll now turn to our next witness, Dr. Pluz Ogun.
Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and the members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you today. The testimony I give here is reflective of my own views and is not intended to reflect the positions of the University of Virginia. My name is Peggy Pluz Ogun, and I am first and foremost the wife and caregiver to my husband, Jim. We are both physicians. On December 2nd, 2021, our lives cracked open. Jim was diagnosed with ALS. At the time, we were both busy clinician scholars. Our lives were full with meaningful work, close family, a community of friends. With this diagnosis, our lives were completely upended. What I remember from medical school about ALS is that it's a diagnosis that a physician dreads more than ever, more than any other. Why? ALS is a disease that robs a person of almost everything essential to living our lives: the ability to move, to communicate, to eat and drink, and eventually to breathe. But the double-edged cruelty is that awareness and cognition are left intact. Persons living with ALS can feel each loss and fear the next one every moment. ALS is 100% fatal. No one has ever survived. Average life expectancy after diagnosis is 2 to 5 years. When given this diagnosis, patients commonly hear, "Go home, hug your loved ones, and get your affairs in order." People worry about giving patients false hope, but I think they don't understand the devastation of having no hope, of simply waiting for the inevitable decline. Both being physicians, we were not naive about ALS. But having no hope was not an option for our family. So like many ALS families, we got moving. We read, we investigated clinical trials, we got involved in advocacy. One unacceptable reality we faced was that the disease moves faster than the FDA. AMX 0035 was a drug in the pipeline that had excellent safety and better evidence for efficacy in a phase 2-3 trial than anything that was currently available. But it was initially denied approval by the FDA, who wanted an additional confirmatory phase 3 trial. This drug is a combination of 2 drugs that had been on the market for many years. One that was over the counter. The only way to obtain the medication was to get the one component, TUDCA, it's called, online, and the other component from a specialty pharmacy in New Jersey off-label, at a cost of around $1,500 to $3,000 a month. Most of our friends in the ALS community could not afford this. Only after fierce advocacy did the FDA take another look at the data and approve it, thankfully. Over 2 years after the results of the clinical trial were clear. What does that 2 years mean for an ALS patient? 2 years ago, Jim was running races. He was the chief medical officer for a new integrated care network for children across the state of Virginia. He started a new program at UVA to care for medically complex children. He had a thriving pediatric practice full of kids and parents who adored him. Today, he is confined to a wheelchair. He needs help to eat. He cannot roll over in bed or even scratch an itch. He is losing his ability to speak. Inside the body that is failing him, Jim is the same brilliant, compassionate, creative, loving human being. The courage he displays every day is stunning. I am Jim's primary caregiver. The nights are the toughest. Every time Jim needs to turn over or adjust his vent mask to pull up the covers, I need to do that for him, and he needs to somehow communicate that need. Were it not for the support of our amazing grown children, extended family, neighbors, and dear friends, I'm not sure what we would do. ALS is relentless. What do you think our life will be like in 6 months? One thing I know, Jim needs to be here. He's got a new grandbaby and a wedding to attend. As a physician, one of my areas of expertise is reducing errors in medicine. Doctors are naturally focused on getting all the data to make a certain diagnosis before we start treating someone. But we've learned over time that in rapidly progressive, life-threatening illnesses, delaying treatment while awaiting that certainty can cost someone their life. So we start treatment while confirmatory data are coming in. I have watched helplessly as my husband lost the ability to use his hands, then his legs, then his voice. In the face of this 100% fatal disease, delaying access to a safe, promising therapy until a confirmatory trial can be achieved is cruel. Jim and I are both old enough to have lived through the AIDS crisis. When I started residency, there were no treatments, and the medical wards were filled with AIDS patients and their loved ones, the patients dying no matter what we did. Then patients and their loved ones got activated. They fought for more research funding. They fought for early access to therapies. I watched as each new therapy, one by one, turned the disease around. The earliest therapies were less effective and had more side effects, but they saved people's lives, while new drugs were added and combined together into cocktails. Like those early HIV activists, we in the ALS community are fighting for more research funding. We are fighting for early access to safe and promising therapies. You have the power to change the landscape of ALS in this Congress, transforming it to a manageable and eventually a curable disease. This is not false hope. It is real hope. We need your urgent action, and we are counting on you. Thank you very much.
Doctor, thanks very much for your testimony, and thanks for sharing your story and Jim's as well. Dr. Batnagar, you may begin your testimony.
Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and honorable members of the committee, I'm honored to testify at today's hearing. Thank you for inviting me. My testimony today is my personal opinion based on my experience over the years. I'm a physician by training. My 25-year career, almost entirely at small companies, has involved developing treatments for cancer, for neurological, psychiatric, cardiovascular, and other diseases, and for the last several years for rare diseases. None of my work, including that on life-saving cancer drugs, has been as meaningful as working with this amazing community of families who have children and adults with Prader-Willi syndrome. Many of them are in the audience today. While the regulatory challenges across therapeutic areas are similar, there is a much more disproportionate impact on patients with rare diseases. A similar disproportionate impact is seen on small companies like ours, which do a large proportion of the high-risk work. Our ability to raise money and continue work depends prominently on regulatory clarity. If the minutes of an FDA meeting do not clearly state a path forward, or if a company receives inconsistent feedback, it could be the difference between having money to carry out a pivotal trial or giving up on a drug to treat a disease that has no options. Speaking of diseases with no options, Prader-Willi syndrome, PWS, is a rare and life-threatening genetic condition which occurs randomly and affects about 10 to 20,000 patients in the US. Children with PWS are often recognized within weeks of birth. By the age of 3 or 4 years, they will start to show more of an interest in food, which increases over time until they ultimately develop the hallmark symptom of hyperphagia, an insatiable desire to eat, the brain telling you that you're starving even as you eat. Individuals affected by PWS never feel full and are constantly focused on one thing, food and how to get it. Left unsupervised, they have the potential to literally eat themselves to death. Much like a teenager with PWS who recently ran away from home, ate enough that his stomach ruptured and he passed away. The only remedy for hyperphagia is to restrict access to food. Closed kitchens, locked refrigerators and pantries, motion-activated cameras, and alarms. Families live in the constant fear of extreme outcomes like visits to ERs, police intervention, and in many situations, the need to be cared for in an institutionalized setting. Invariably, there is a need for constant supervision for life. Numerous drugs have been tested to treat hyperphagia and PWS in late-stage trials. Each one of them has failed, and many companies have been dissolved. Our drug, DCCR, is a once-a-day pill based on a known parent molecule, which was evaluated in an approval-directed study from 2018 through 2020, ending a few months after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The study missed its primary endpoint, but the analysis of the pre-COVID data showed statistical significance in favor of the drug. Long-term data, now up to 4 years in some patients, and comparisons to natural history of the disease show statistically significant and clinically meaningful improvements with the drug. We've been asked to generate additional control data before submitting a marketing application to the FDA. We have just completed the study, which shows highly statistically significant and clinically meaningful benefits of DCCR, and we hope to submit an NDA to the FDA next year. We need a regulatory framework that recognizes the novel, complex, and heartbreaking nature of diseases like PWS. We cannot continue to apply the same regulatory paradigm to all diseases and all drugs. Context must play a role. It's amazing to see new options available for people with ALS and the first approval of a drug for Friedreich's ataxia. But there's also diseases like Barth syndrome, where a drug with promising data may not have a path forward. Regulatory delays, such as the 3+ year back and forth with the FDA, have real-life impacts. For companies like ours, programs will be cut, some will even shut their doors. Every day, every week, every month, every year, symptoms will worsen, sometimes in irreversible manners, and patients may even die as they wait for treatments. The FDA is and needs to remain the premier regulatory body of its kind in the world. What is desirable is a rigorous regulatory process, but one that balances the risk of approving a drug with the risk of having no treatments available for a desperate population. The Promising Pathway Act is a significant step in the right direction. Time-limited provisional approval would allow patients the ability to access potentially life-changing treatments as additional meaningful data is generated to justify their use. Availability of such treatments would be driven by clinically relevant data, and final approval would come only upon rigorous analysis of data generated from patient registries. In closing, I truly appreciate the opportunity to share Soleno's story, highlight the significant unmet needs of the rare disease communities, in particular the PWS community. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Doctor, thanks very much for your testimony. Next, we'll move to Professor Fernandez-Lynch for your testimony. You may begin.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to inform today's discussion about how best to achieve a goal we all share, helping patients with rare, serious diseases live better and survive longer. My name is Holly Fernandez-Lynch. I'm an assistant professor of medical ethics and law at the University of Pennsylvania, speaking only on my own behalf. As you heard, my scholarship focuses on FDA drug approval policy, access to medicines prior to FDA approval, and clinical research ethics and oversight. I sit before you as an academic on a panel filled with lived experience, in a room filled with lived experience. I am not personally living with a rare, serious disease, but the sad reality is that rare diseases are not rare in the aggregate. Any one of us could find ourselves or our loved ones affected at any time. And like many, my family has not been spared from serious and life-threatening diseases, including Parkinson's and childhood cancer. We all have an interest in these important issues, whether we're suffering today or maybe suffering tomorrow. My key message to the committee is that weakening FDA's approval standards risks conflating the essential goal of getting patients access to more drugs that work with the deflated goal of simply getting them more drugs. Of course, we should tolerate more uncertainty when considering drugs for serious diseases. Thankfully, FDA already has expansive regulatory flexibility, allowing it to do just that. The agency is granting accelerated approvals more frequently and more broadly than it has in the past. It has also demonstrated willingness to approve drugs when trials fail to show benefit on pre-specified endpoints, when benefit is supported by just one pivotal study, when trials are very small, and when they lack concurrent control groups. Unfortunately, this flexibility is not always met with rigorous confirmation of benefit after drug approval, which is a concern also raised by the Promising Pathway Act. The proposed bill has some important strengths. For example, it seeks to limit how long drugs with uncertain benefit can stay on the market. And it emphasizes that uncertain drug approvals should always be followed by efforts to collect additional evidence. However, I fear that the Promising Pathway Act would set the bar too low for both provisional approval and later confirmation of benefit. Now, I certainly understand why any individual patient might be willing to pursue access to a new drug based on relevant early evidence of a positive therapeutic outcome, the bill's proposed standard. The problem is that weak approval standards affect all patients, not only those who choose to take a provisionally approved drug. Companies produce evidence about safety and effectiveness because it is a legal requirement for marketing and to profit from their drugs. If FDA demands less evidence, patients and clinicians will have less evidence. We see this today in the dietary supplement industry. But imagine if what you had available to treat your life-threatening illness was rows and rows of products, none of which were known to work. Weak approval standards can also entrench poor treatments by making it difficult to study potentially better treatment options, both because of reduced willingness to enroll and challenges interpreting results when new drugs are compared to unproven ones. The Promising Pathway Act proposes to address these challenges by relying on patient registries. But because registries lack randomization and blinding, observed differences in outcomes might be attributable to underlying differences between patients rather than a result of the drug of interest. Instead of weakening FDA's already flexible approval standard, the stronger path forward is to address scientific bottlenecks. FDA and others have already taken important steps in this direction. The agency recently launched a program informally dubbed Operation Warp Speed for Rare Disease, which will provide real-time advice to companies starting at the earliest stages of drug development to speed successful trials, address manufacturing issues, and other challenges. The agency also has a pilot program to advance development of new endpoints for rare diseases. Its action plan for rare neurodegenerative diseases and its ALS science strategy emphasize improved scientific understanding of rare disease, enhanced clinical trial infrastructure, and innovative trial designs to support the development of better drugs. While the science continues to develop, the best way for this committee to improve access to effective rare disease treatments is by ensuring adequate funding for rare disease research, promoting clinical trial accessibility, encouraging use of FDA's expanded access pathway, and clarifying that FDA has the authority to require and enforce rigorous post-market efficacy studies whenever it approves a drug with uncertain benefit. Thank you for your commitment to these important issues, and I look forward to your questions.
Professor, thanks very much. And our sixth and final witness, Mr. Deserich.
Thank you, Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss the Promising Pathway Act. It's something that I consider vital to our efforts to find the home run cure for cancer. I'm Keith Deserich. I'm chairman, co-founder of the Cure Starts Now Foundation. I'm board member of the DIPG-DMG Collaborative. I'm president of the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium, but most importantly, I'm a father. My daughter Elena fought a cancer called DIPG when she was just 6 years old. We had no hope, there were no trials available, and they told us to go home and make memories. Sadly, she understood this as well, fully aware until her very last day that there was nothing that we could do. You see, with DIPG, each day you see your child lose something. One day, it was her ability to be able to see out of her left eye. The next day, it was her ability to speak, then her ability to walk, until one day it became her ability to swallow, to breathe, and her heartbeat. What's particularly cruel about this type of disease is that it affects children, and it's very, very rare in adults. But at the same time, many experts believe that this is a cancer that can show the most promise, at the same time as believing that this is a cancer that they fear most. Universally, for this reason, it is known as a home run cure cancer. We have made it our mission to focus on these rare cancers, building tools from scratch such as a registry that spans 129 hospitals, intelligent patient tools, strategic research, and even virtual hospitals to try to leverage all of the great guidance and intelligence that we can find worldwide to come to bear on one specific patient. And in the 17 years since Elena lost her fight, we have invested in over $30 million in research and support through 135 projects. I understand the perspectives of the researcher, I understand the perspectives of the parents, I understand the perspectives of the registry. I come to you having seen each of these various elements of it, in addition to talking with parents each and every day when they're in their last weeks. I also come to here with hope. I hope for a new way to fight cancer. I believe that the FDA is well-intentioned, but in the end, no one plans for this type of devastating cancer. Sadly, I believe that there's much confusion inherited from bureaucracy, and whether by regulation or guidance clarity, I argue that the system is broken and the status quo will not do. For our purposes, there are effectively only two measures that we can consider when we start to talk about DIPG. One is expanded access, and the other one is right to try. It's important to note that with expanded access or compassionate use, it is not an alternative for the Promising Pathway Act. I know this not only from dealing with the loss of my daughter, but also in calls with over 200 families per year asking for help, any help, in their last and final days. With DIPG, a patient is frequently only given 2 weeks after progression to act. Expanded access requires 4 levels of approval: 24 hours for a family to reconcile with the news, 3 days for a doctor to determine a strategy, 2 weeks for an internal review board to approve a methodology, 3 days for a pharmaceutical company to respond, and up to 30 days for the FDA to effectively approve the entire process. That's 1 week longer than our child survives. It doesn't work. Then there's right to try. It's slightly better with a 2-level approval process, but it lacks data transparency to patients and families with an annual report model that submits to the FDA. We think clarity, we think transparency are cornerstones of being able to find the cure. All of these, though, and the current guidelines assume that terminal means months or years to live. They assume that patients are not intelligent to make decisions for themselves. They assume that data in less than ideal situations are worthless. And they assume that every patient is an adult. And the assumptions are wrong. The reality is we don't get doctors that understand the systems. We don't get a callback on the weekend. And none of these acts were designed for pediatric terminal diseases. The Promising Pathway Act is different. It offers an alternative to FDA-mandated unethical practice of trials giving the wrong drug to the wrong patients for pediatric terminal diseases. Right now, nearly every therapy designed for pediatric cancer is guided through a 3-phase adult trial before we can even get to try it on a terminally diagnosed child. Sadly enough, some of these cancers don't even affect adults like DIPG, meaning that we either misapply a trial on the wrong patients, or worse yet, the drug company simply gives up. Now remember that some of our biggest advances in cancer started with pediatric cancer. You want to know why we can't advance a cure? This is why. The PPA also preserves critical data on outlier participants in a trial and retains it for the use by the FDA, the drug companies, the researchers, and the patients in any third-party registry of substance, thus improving transparency. PPA also addresses insurance coverage and financial burdens in ways that neither previous alternative has. Finally, the PPA, or Promising Pathway Act, advances innovative therapies that may be impossible to subject to current trial design. Keep in mind that trials for rare cancers rarely ever get full accruals, leading us to either give up on good ideas or enrolling children in older trials that we already know don't work. It is not lost on me the value of a clinical trial, but what is lost on many others is the value of a quick and efficient clinical trial. Unfortunately, with rare pediatric cancers, we have to consider both this, and sadly in their final days, we also have to consider compassion. I have this pile in front of me of grants. These are grants that we have worked to build, to fund at many different institutions. There's 46 of them. This is a pile which has hope. This is a pile which is the dreams of the researchers, and frankly, it could be the lives of these kids. This is 46 chances to be able to cure cancer. And sadly, the whole reason why I'm here today is because I believe that these 46 opportunities to be able to cure cancer may never reach bedside unless we get PPA passed. I'm a big believer in personal initiative, but in this case, we may be able to go no further unless government gets out of the way. The Promising Pathway is how we do this. Families are desperate for another chance, a chance at seeing their children go to kindergarten, a chance to see their child get a driver's license, a chance to see them graduate from high school, a chance to see them go to college and get married. We want a chance to see them grow up. Rarely do you have a chance or a bill that asks for no money, and then money is not really part of what we're asking for. This is that rare case when you can act to give patients fighting for their lives the power to save their own lives. I lost my daughter, but I refuse to believe that we cannot save others. You've heard today from some very compelling and well-educated witnesses. I'm the only one, however, that has lost everything in this and was given no options because there wasn't any. There was existing barriers that were either too cumbersome or our policies were built around the majority. And while some of these numbers may appear small from the aggregate, in the end, it is with this type of cancer that experts also believe that we will have the greatest impact to be able to cure it. And so what we may ignore may be precisely what must save us. The Promising Pathway Act may be the single biggest piece of legislation that costs nearly nothing, but may change everything about how we win this war against cancer. Thank you.
Mr. Desserich, thanks so much for your testimony and for sharing the story of your family and your daughter.
Thank you.
I'll now turn to Ranking Member Braun to begin a round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question is for Brian Wallach. Brian, if you're still with us here on Zoom, we appreciate your testimony earlier, and because of your work, you've got so many people engaged in the cause, and kudos to you for that. Question, what would your risk tolerance be for a new therapy that has documented real-world evidence showing efficacy and has received provisional approval from the FDA? We'll come back to Brian if he's still with us on Zoom. Okay.
I think there's
Go ahead, Brian.
delay.
I have no other option for new treatments other than the expanded access program or provisional approval. And as my disease is 100% fatal, I am willing to take risk that other patients may not be, because I know that if I do not try, I know that if I do not try safe, promising treatments, I will die. And as Peggy said, we know that each treatment does not make a cure, but together they can create a cocktail similar to what we had in HIV that will keep me alive and turn ALS from fatal to chronic. And so my simple answer is that ALS patients are willing to accept greater risk because we know what is behind door number 2.
Thank you, Brian. Next question will be for Mr. Deserick. Thank you for sharing your story. Sorry for the loss of your daughter. Your advocacy, though, of course, means a lot to her and her legacy. Do you feel that any current drug approval or access programs at the FDA address rare terminal pediatric cases like DIPG?
I don't. That's the reason I'm here. I'm here because there isn't anything that applies to this. I mean, the amount of patients that we talk to that are reaching out to us, and they're reaching out to us partially because they're not getting any answers from medicine or drug companies or anything of that sort. It's almost impossible at that point. And it's because of really two things. One reason is because of time. We don't have that time. We have 2 weeks. Nothing gets done in those 2 weeks. I've had so many times where I've seen a compassionate use has been approved for a patient, but it usually comes in several days after the patient has already passed. You want to talk about a difficult call? That's a horrible call to make. I've also seen where it doesn't address anything having to do with pediatric. We write laws with the idea of adults. And if you look at any of these guidelines that we have put forth through the FDA, we grant waivers for them not to do it in pediatrics, but we never go the opposite way. And so because of that, we have to wait, and we have to hope that it can go through all of the adult trials first before it can ever get to a child trial. And so it never gets started. And so at the end of the day, we can't get access to those drugs. The time is not the right amount of time. And the children are being ignored in this. And it shouldn't be that way.
Thank you. I'll yield back. I do have more questions. Back to Chairman Casey.
I'd say to Ranking Member Braun, if you want to
Go ahead.
If you want to ask another one. Still had about a minute, so.
This question will be for Dr. Plews Ogun. FDA has a variety of drug approval pathways and designations. In recent years, the agency has begun to take steps towards creating a more accessible and flexible system. However, millions of Americans with these diseases still lack any FDA-approved treatments. Could you highlight the holes in the FDA's drug approval and clinical trial system that your husband, James, has fallen through?
Thank you for that question. So I'll just mention two. One, I think we've heard a lot about today, and I want to be really clear that that problem is really important to me, and that problem that I would like to see solved is that patients who are dying don't have timely access to promising, safe therapies. Just to be clear, I don't think anyone you've heard speak is suggesting a change to the safety standard. This is about time, it's about access. The FDA process involves, first of all, early trials to establish safety, phase 2 trials to confirm safety and establish potential efficacy, and then phase 3 trials. The phase 3 confirmatory trials to confirm efficacy can take an additional 4 to 8 years. These are years, obviously, that no one on this, sitting at this table has had for themselves or their loved ones. The time it takes for these confirmatory trials is simply too much for these particular patients with these particular diseases. So we want access to promising therapies when early evidence has been established and is being confirmed. All we want as an alternative to certain death is a pathway that allows us access to these therapies at the point where safety and promising evidence and effectiveness have been established. The second point I want to make is that there's been a lot of talk about the accelerated pathway. Accelerated pathway is really not available to patients with ALS at this point, at least 95% of patients with ALS, because there is no reliable biomarker, and the accelerated pathway requires or relies on biomarkers or surrogate endpoints. So that's another huge hole for someone like Jim. That pathway really doesn't apply.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Bhatnagar on biotech risk. On these diseases, mostly smaller companies address them. can be billions of dollars, years to submit a new drug application to the FDA. Larger companies generally don't do it. Tell me a little bit about, is the market cooling for this due to the fact that we got a process that is stubborn and bureaucratic?
Thank you, Senator, and the answer is yes. There are parts of the biotech ecosystem that are doing well. I mean, science is robust. Patient advocacy is stronger than it's ever been before. But what's cooling is the funding environment. And you can see that if you look at the XBI, which is a gauge of public companies, it's down more than about 30% this year. This may be the third year in a row it's down at a stretch, which would be the first time that's the case since it was first conceived. Number of companies going under has been phenomenal. Number of layoffs has been extraordinary. So yes, the ecosystem is
And would the
cooling.
Promising Pathways Act address that in a way that would be meaningful so we at least keep businesses in business to try to work on these ailments?
I think so. When you think of why that's the case, I think the uncertainty in the regulatory environment is a big factor for rare disease companies. Companies like mine, we work on 1 or 2 programs. And if you don't have the clarity, then it's hard to get the funding to do the work. So yes, if there is a pathway that is more certain, it would definitely help.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun. I'll next move to my questions. I also wanted to note we obviously have a number of senators who've been here. Some have been here and won't be back. Some will be back. But after my questions, in order of appearance, we'll go to Senator Scott. We've also had Senator Gillibrand, Senator Blumenthal here. And let me just go to my first maybe 2 questions. Dr. Bhatnagar, I wanted to ask you a question, but as a predicate for that, I understand that one of the challenges in rare disease drug development is that there are often very few true experts in the disease, and that this presents difficulties at different stages of the drug review process. FDA has acknowledged these challenges and indicated they're open to revising some of the policies to ensure clinical expertise for rare disease therapy. So, Doctor, here's my question. As you've worked through this drug development process, are there areas where greater expertise in rare diseases like, as you mentioned, PWS, Prader-Willi syndrome, among FDA expertise for that syndrome, among others, among those FDA reviewers, are there instances where that would be helpful, that greater expertise?
Thank you, Senator, and yes, it would be helpful. When you're dealing with a disease like Prader-Willi syndrome, we don't expect that there would be expertise at the FDA because it is a rare disease. So we would hope that there is that understanding and the idea that from the very beginning of the process, there would be experts at the other end. That's not been the case. We generally take physician experts with us, but unfortunately, they're considered to be conflicted. The problem in rare diseases, which is very different from other large mass market type of diseases, is that you generally involve all experts in the clinical trials. Otherwise, you would not be able to enroll those trials. So if you believe them to be conflicted, then who would be the expert? So I think this is one not very difficult thing that can be implemented. You can take their opinions with a grain of salt, but at least consider them to be not conflicted and speaking for the disease.
Doctor, thanks very much. I just have one more question before turning to Senator Scott. Professor Fernandez-Lynch, how can the FDA ensure it's consulting with these appropriate disease experts while also ensuring transparency around, say, potential conflicts of interest during the review of products for rare diseases?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So this comes up very often when FDA is trying to populate the advisory committees of external experts that it often calls upon to help them understand various issues related to whether or not they should be approving products, as well as broader questions about drug development in particular areas. FDA can waive, the conflicts in certain circumstances. For example, where there is a dearth of experts in a given area, and they often do waive the typical conflict of interest rules. There are other ways also of managing conflict. So, for example, if you include somebody who has ties with industry or has participated in trials, you can also invite additional people to provide their broader perspectives. So I think this is already something that is happening at FDA. They're well aware of the challenge, and in fact, it's more often academics like myself who are pushing FDA to be more careful about conflicts than they already are.
Thank you, Professor, and I'll move to Senator Scott.
First, I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for putting together this hearing. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank all of our witnesses. I think everybody in this country has probably been impacted, as somebody's been impacted by a rare disease, and in healthcare, they've either impacted by something that they did not had access to, or if they did, the difficulty of affording the healthcare in this country. It's really tough. I built a hospital company, and your just heart goes out to people how expensive things have also gotten on top of the regulatory hurdles you go through. So, my first employee in my hospital company actually had and passed away with ALS, and it's a devastating disease. So your heart goes out to anybody that has it. One thing I did as governor of Florida is when I was governor, we got all the money. We dramatically increased our research dollars on cancer, and we got all of our cancer centers and everybody who's doing research in the state. They got money. They had to share all their data, which to accelerate it, and that seemed to have some impact. We put a lot of money into NIH. In the 2000s, we I think doubled the budget of the NIH, but clearly cures haven't come out. So I think we have to just do what all of you are saying, rethink what we're doing to see if there's something better we can do. And I'm glad you're here, because this is how we get things done, by by people telling their stories. And so, because if your story, you can come up with how you can try to solve it. So, Dr. Botner, what can Congress do to expedite the delays that you're seeing?
Thank you, Senator. Firstly, I want to just acknowledge that Florida is the epicenter of PWS care in the world. The University of Florida has a physician by the name of Jennifer Miller, who sees the largest population of PWS patients in the country. To answer your question, it's probably true that the FDA already has the authority needed to provide regulatory flexibility in the circumstances that we're talking about. Unfortunately, there is no consistent application of that flexibility. So I don't know what tool it takes, but I think to mandate the consideration of regulatory flexibility in all rare disease applications is valuable. I think to work with experts to define for a given disease setting what that flexibility should look like is important. And then to come up with an enforcement mechanism to ensure that it's happening is important. So I'm not sure what tool it takes, but I think conceptually that's how I would go about it.
Yeah. Well, in May of this year, I joined you with 24 of my colleagues in both the Senate and the House asking for change at the FDA. We requested a task force be developed to include leaders from all divisions, offices, and centers which process rare disease therapy applications to fully examine areas of policy and procedural inconsistency and shortcoming to see what we could do better. We also asked that the task force provide Congress recommendations. The FDA disagreed with our request to form a task force. They said they're going to share relevant reports. But I think a lot of times up here, people do have the authority to do the right things. It's just the way the process is set up, and then there's no accountability that it doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. So, the more specific you guys are to any of us, the greater chance we're able to get something done. So, do any of you know what type of patient experience the FDA collects in its clinical trials, and how's the FDA use that? Does anybody have any ideas?
I think patient experiences can be collected in a variety of ways. One of the newer mechanisms which the FDA has been using is a patient-focused drug development meeting where the FDA attends and listens to the patient populations about the unmet needs, et cetera. During trials, in trials like ours, we collect patient information based on questionnaires, looking at symptoms and signs that are relevant. So the agency definitely has a lot of that evidence in their hands. Real-world evidence is something that they've been discussing, but it's been part of very small number of applications for approval, and it's certainly not been the primary way any drug has been approved so far. Dr. Lynch, if you have something to add.
So just to add on to that, importantly, of course, it's not FDA that is gathering the evidence, right? It's companies that are responsible for conducting the research. But through the patient-focused drug development program at FDA, they've put out several guidance documents to promote systematic methodologies in gathering patient experience data to inform the development of clinical trials, to make sure that they are asking the questions that are important to patients and systematically gathering information so that it can inform regulatory decisions. And FDA also has made great strides in incorporating patient perspectives, for example, having patient representatives on advisory committees.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Ranking Member Braun.
I think from the discussion you've heard today that it's clear that there's a difference between the broad array of diseases out there, the places where most pharmaceutical companies go, and that with everything we're talking about here, it's just not being addressed. And Keith, I'd like you to comment on, is the paradigm that we have currently working? And especially in the case of one with a narrow window of survival, and within the paradigm that is, to me, bureaucratic, has not responded in a way to these over a long period of time. Is there any hope that we can get it done within that current structure?
I think that the comments that we were talking about of what's being collected and also comes down to the guidance as opposed to regulations, and as was pointed out, the idea that it probably could be done in the right way, but unfortunately it isn't. And I think that
is that called compassionate use in the current framework?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it could be. They could take any of these measures and they could probably try to bend it with it, but it doesn't happen. Yeah. And I think that's the reason why PPA really needs to be there, is because otherwise, without it, there's nothing that's going to make sure that there's any accountability to deliver the right decision on it. We witness this time and time again. I've talked to drug companies and they tell me they can't figure it out. They feel that what is in the guidelines versus what is in the guidance or the suggestions that they receive back is not matching up. I talked to a drug company just last week, and they said they're probably not going to be focusing on our realm and on pediatric drugs, because
that's why we need the formality of PPA.
Exactly, because they see no way that it's going to work, and they're giving up. And we can't have that. These are small drug companies, but that's where sometimes the best ideas come from. And if we take away the opportunity to consider those good ideas, that's a problem. And I think the other thing that we miss is really the patient right type of thing. We talk about data collection. We talk about the idea of being able to have it at the pharmaceutical level or in the FDA. Data isn't the property of one entity over another. There has to be also a patient element to this. That's the beauty of what is in the Promising Pathway Act, is also the international register, or these registries that are in there, these independent registries, which allow for everybody to be able to communicate that, but still protect the patient privacy at the same time. And otherwise, we're just going to get half of the information. We're going to be following what we think is necessarily the guidance on it. And effectively what we're left with is a Wild West type of mentality as to how we deal with drug trials. And we can't keep doing it that way, because if that's the case, we're never going to be able to get anywhere on this.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun. Senator Warren.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say I very much appreciate Senator Braun holding this hearing and advancing this important idea. For individuals who are experiencing a devastating diagnosis, the promise of a new therapy or a cure provides hope in a profoundly dark time. And that's why I have long described federal support for medical research as one of the best investments that our nation can make, and why I've introduced legislation to ensure that we fully invest in medical breakthroughs. I want to, if I can today, talk about just a slightly different part of what happens in the drug approval process that I'm concerned about. I want to talk about how we get research from the lab to the pharmacy. And one of the key parts of that, as many of the people in this room know, is clinical trials. Once a promising therapy is identified, pharmaceutical manufacturers have to test the drug for safety and effectiveness, which involves enrolling patients in clinical trials. Patients place enormous trust in the people running clinical trials, which is why all research involving human subjects in the United States must be approved by institutional review boards, or IRBs. Professor Fernandez-Lynch, you lead work on the quality and effectiveness of IRBs. Can you just say a little bit more about what the job of IRBs actually is?
Of course. Thank you, Senator, for the question. IRBs have been required to review nearly all federally funded research and federally regulated research for several decades now. And their responsibility is to protect the rights and welfare of people who participate in studies by making sure that the risks and benefits of research are appropriately balanced and that there's adequate informed consent. They prevent ethically problematic research from proceeding, and they also help make sure that the science is strong, because when people are giving their time and energy to participating, that's an important element of trust, and they shouldn't be exposed to unnecessary burden and risk. But then IRBs also have a very important responsibility to facilitate high-quality research and to promote ethical research to answer questions that will benefit patients and society.
All right. So as I understand this, if a clinical trial can't answer the questions it sets out to study or doesn't properly communicate the risks of the study to the people who participate in it, then it is the job of an IRB to step in and keep patients safe. But rapid consolidation and private equity ownership of IRBs has raised some serious questions about whether these boards are leaving vulnerable patients exposed to unnecessary risks. Now, while most IRBs are affiliated with universities, IRBs that are not associated with any institution, they're known as commercial IRBs, are reviewing a larger share of drug clinical trials. And according to a recent GAO report, despite representing just 2% of the review boards, these commercial IRBs now review over half of studies involving investigational new drugs, and 92% of them are reviewed by just 2 private equity-backed companies. So the GAO reported that private equity-backed IRBs, I'm going to quote here, are beholden to their clients or equity holders. In other words, the people who put the money up. Professor Fernandez-Lynch, what are the risks that this creates for clinical trial participants?
Thank you, Senator Warren, and I very much appreciate that you pushed the GAO to examine this issue. I wasn't surprised by their finding that we still lack meaningful measures of IRB quality. This is something that has come up time and time again. And the lack of our ability to assess quality meaningfully makes it hard to comparatively assess these different types of IRBs, which is a problem that I'm working on in my own research. One challenge and concern about private equity ownership and profit-oriented goals in the IRB space is that it creates a primary emphasis on speedy approvals of proposed research and keeping the sponsor happy. And that emphasis on speed also kind of trickles down from the private equity IRBs to the university IRBs who have to compete with them. Now, of course, speed can be a very good and important thing when we're talking about research. We want high-quality research to move quickly. But focusing on speed can also inhibit deep attention to ethical concerns, and it can also limit the focus on maximizing scientific quality and really just approving science that is good enough, kind of meets the floor of regulatory requirements, rather than making sure it is maximally valuable. And so I think that's a primary concern here.
So I appreciate you raising this because I just want to make sure we get this right. The GAO found that an emphasis on profits can lead private equity-backed IRBs to rubber stamp reviews of drug clinical trials and focus less on potential harm to research subjects. And while HHS and FDA are responsible for inspecting IRBs to ensure that participants are protected, the number and frequency of these inspections has been steadily decreasing. So HHS and FDA need to step up their oversight efforts in this area, and that includes clarifying what it means for an IRB to be working effectively, something that these agencies have never done despite decades of requests, so that clinical trial participants have complete confidence in the scientific integrity of the trials that they join and feeling certain that these have been fully vetted. So that's my concern in this space and why I wanted to raise it. I want to say again, thank you to Senator Braun for holding this hearing. I look forward to continuing to fight alongside you for patients with rare and progressive diseases. We need to do better in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Vance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Desirik. So, first, let me just say, I've got a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old, and my heart goes out to you because I know that you've engaged in this fight because you lost a 7-year-old daughter, and I know there are a lot of other folks here who've lost kids, and my heart goes out to you as well. The goal here, of course, is to try to get to a society where no parent has to bury their own kid because of an illness that's currently incurable. I know we're all working towards that goal. And the worry that I have is that given the limited patient populations, because some of these diseases are incredibly rare, and because of how differently we treat pediatric illnesses and the medicines to treat pediatric illnesses, that we're making some mistakes here. And I know, Mr. Desirik, there is an argument that the right to try legislation, the expanded access that happened during the last administration, which I think was a good thing, that satisfies some of the concerns that you have with the current way in which we give patients access to these drugs. I'd like you maybe just to explain why that's not right. What are we still not doing correctly in this space?
Well, I think anytime that we've tried any of the right to try elements within our specific disease classification, there's been an unwillingness to make it apply to pediatrics. Right to try seems to be something that may have some adult applications to it, and I can't really speak to it because I don't touch those populations. But within the pediatric realm with it, everybody's kind of looked at it and said, well, yeah, it's not going to go for children's cancers. And I think that's really the cornerstone of everything that we're talking about here, is because I think what we tend to do is we tend to think it along the lines of the ideal circumstance. We think of it as a clinical trial and how these can be perfected and how we can do better with it. But at the end of the day, all these acts and all these regulations are dealing with imperfect scenarios. A clinical trial requires things such as investment, accrual, time, biomarkers, and certainly a completion. And the issue is while we all, I think, see the need for clinical trials, we're dealing with scenarios to which these things don't exist. We can't get it. You know, we can't get accruals. I mean, I'm witnessing right now a trial that we're putting out there with kids in our disease classification, and they have an accrual number of 400 patients. We only have 400 kids that are diagnosed per year. That means this trial is never going to get finished. It's going to have 8 years to be able to get there, and by then we're already going to know whether it works or doesn't work with it. And so you can't think of it in those ways. We have to go into this with the idea that we don't have the things to do the clinical trials sometimes. And so Promising Pathway effectively fills that need.
So, Mr. Desser, can you explain to me just this particular point? So very often, and I've worked with companies, and in my private life, my prior life, I should say, when I was in the private sector, we actually worked with some biopharmaceutical companies doing clinical trials. One of the things, of course, you're trying to do in some of these cancer therapeutics is identify whether the addition of the therapeutic increases the life of the patient, right? It's one of the primary endpoints oftentimes. But in some of the diseases we're dealing with, especially in pediatric cases, extending the time from 3 months of life to 9 months of life is not really practical because the time given for the individual patient, for a child, is so small. So the idea that you're going to somehow reach a classic adult endpoint in a pediatric case sometimes just doesn't make any sense, does it?
Absolutely not. I mean, we can't reach those endpoints. I mean, frankly, I think our community is happy with anything that we can add. I mean, just another day is what we're looking for.
Sure.
And we've seen some things that have worked, that we've applied, and we try to do this with. And they've added months. Right now, I would guess from looking at some of the registry data, we see that they've probably expanded that by threefold, and that's good. But we were only talking about, maybe 6 months. So threefold is a year and a half. That's not a life by any stretch of the imagination. Will it ever be at that case? So it's just, we have to take it and we have to try to grow it as much as we can.
I appreciate that. I appreciate all of you for being here. And the last comment I'd make here is that we all understand that we have to do better. And what occurs to me just in looking at the Senator Braun's PPA and just talking with Mr. Deserek, both in this context and in others, is that we have a clinical trial situation. We have a clinical trial infrastructure in this country that's in some ways designed for adult diseases and very common diseases. And if we don't fix the underlying infrastructure, we may have a lot of kids out there who are languishing, who are dying, not because there aren't therapeutics and not because there isn't capital to invest in these new therapeutics, but because the regulatory regime doesn't allow us to actually try these things and figure out whether they work. I think we need to fix that problem. I applaud Senator Braun for trying to take a swing at it.
If I may add something to that as well with it, the other thing I think that we also miss is that for the most part, we view our kids as not the same level as an adult case. And so what we do is we tend to say, let's take a drug that we know works in some other cancer and let's give it a try in kids. And okay, for that, we can do clinical trials. For those, we can put them out there. But what happens most often is, especially right now, with all the knowledge and all the investment that we put into this and the registries and the tracking and the patterns and everything we've been able to find, for the first time, we have an ability to craft a drug that focuses on DIPG. But now, I can't get it out. I can't get it to a bedside because I can't put it in adults. Adults don't normally get this. So we're at a stop point. By reference to you, and the reason for bringing these 46 grants is to impress upon you how important it is, because I don't think I can get a lot of these into a clinical trial.
Thank you, Senator Vance. Before turning to Senator Warnock, I just want to give you a sense of the time constraints we're under now. We have a vote that is opened and well underway. After Senator Warnock, I'll turn to Senator Braun, and then I might have one quick question, and then we'll have to conclude the hearing. But Senator Warnock.
Thank you very much, Chair Casey and Ranking Member Braun, for holding this important hearing today. And I'm really grateful for your leadership on this issue, particularly Ranking Member Braun, it's great to work with you on legislation to advance this important work. I've heard from Georgians across the state who have been personally affected by rare and serious diseases from ALS to Barth syndrome to many others. And despite the differences in these diseases, there is one thing they have in common. Patients desperately need improved access to treatment. And that is why I was proud to co-sponsor Ranking Member Braun's Promising Pathway Act. That's good public policy. And it would help patients with life-threatening diseases receive early access to promising treatments. Mr. Deserich, how would the Promising Pathway Act improve access to life-saving treatments for patients who have serious diagnoses? And I ask this, recognizing that you have been personally impacted by this, even as you remember your own daughter. And so let me thank you for translating your pain into power and being such an important voice on this. And so from your experience, how would the Promising Pathway Act help?
Well, I think in our case with it, it's a question of time and direction towards pediatrics. I think everybody looks at this as the Promising Pathway Act as an ability to be able to find something that generally satisfies the safety requirements, and we can try to move it towards giving it a conditional approval. So we're certainly moving that up, and I think that helps any patient in a terminal diagnosis. And with regards to the pediatric side of things, what Promising Pathways does that I think better than others is it allows it to move faster into the pediatric realm especially in those rare and terminal cases. Now, that's not all cases. There's also some specific definitions of what is a terminal case in this that I think really help to provide some clarity to it. But short of that, we can't get it there. We can't get these trials into the pediatric realm with it. We need a perfect, ideal scenario, and the cancers that we're dealing with are absolutely nothing close to ideal. It changes everything.
And it's also important that we include patient perspective and priorities into our therapy development. Professor Fernandez-Lynch, can you discuss some of the advances that the patient-focused drug development program have provided?
Of course. Thank you for the question, Senator Warnock. FDA has a formal program called Patient-Focused Drug Development, and it's worth acknowledging the major strides the agency has made over the past several decades, starting with the HIV/AIDS advocacy push to help FDA recognize that patients deserve a seat at the table. Patient-focused drug development really refers to a systematic approach to ensuring that patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into both drug development and FDA's evaluation of drugs, because it recognizes that patients have expertise in the diseases that they are facing. It's important to hear from patients, and FDA has stated that it needs to hear from patients about clinical trial design and what are the endpoints that are meaningful to them, what are the things that should be measured in trials, what makes clinical trials feasible to participate in.
And I hate to interrupt, but I'm going to be out of time in a little bit. Do you have an example of advances made by the program that you could share?
What I can share with you are the types of activities that FDA has engaged in, which are a variety of guidance documents to help companies understand how to systematically collect information from patients that will be meaningful. And they also have a program to develop clinical outcome assessments, which are also intended to be specific endpoints that are meaningful to patients. And then in addition to the patient-focused drug development program, there's been further incorporation of patient voices as representatives on advisory committees to FDA.
Thank you. Patients' voices are critical to this process, and thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Warnock. I'll turn to Ranking Member Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before my last question, Senator Murkowski from Alaska wants to enter into the Senator Murkowski from Alaska wants to enter into the record by unanimous consent support for the Promising Pathways Act.
Without objection.
Last question, Dr. Botniger. So often you hear folks have to leave the country to get leading edge treatment. That's a shame. We should be that leading edge, and we should have a system that accommodates it. Could you talk about the difference between our system and one that seems to be working better, which would be in Europe, in terms of how they've done provisional approval? And please comment on that, because if that's better, we should at least be emulating that.
Thank you, Senator. It's a good question, and I think it's debatable which one is better. I think it is true that there are certain therapies where access is more elsewhere. I think our regulators are clearly top-notch. The world looks up to the FDA for what they're going to do. But I think there are times when there are delays which are unnecessary. There are situations such as approving drugs early in the process where we don't have the same considerations. So just very quickly, because I know we're almost out of time, the accelerated approval pathway as it exists in the US really is focused on two constructs. One is you have a known biomarker or a surrogate that predicts benefit. And the second is an intermediate clinical benefit that predicts ultimate use. The challenge with both of these is that neither of them is really present in most rare disease situations. Last year, CDER approved 37 drugs. 6 were accelerated. 5 of them were oncology drugs. 1 was a non-malignant hematology drug. The point is that oncology is an area where these diseases are really well understood. Other rare diseases, we cannot use the pathways. Europe has prospectively defined certain things that they can do on a regulatory side. You can negotiate a study design with the regulators prior to approval and get an approval in that manner. We don't have the same provisions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun. I just have one more question. I know we have to wrap up. Professor Fernandez-Lynch, in your testimony, you stated the following, quote, "It is certainly understandable for individual patients to be willing to risk substantial uncertainty for themselves before better evidence becomes available, especially when they have no time to lose, and I support their right to do so via expanded access. However, weakened approval standards affect all patients," unquote. Could you talk about this balance that I know we all want to strike from an ethical perspective, the balance between the needs of the patients when not all patients have the same needs or the same level of risk tolerance?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. One of the things that I've often heard in the context of discussing promising pathways is if patients don't want to take a provisionally approved drug, then of course they don't have to. And that's absolutely true. But it becomes more complicated because when you lower FDA approval standards, that tells industry this is the bar that you have to meet. When that bar is lowered, then industry responds accordingly. And what that does is push back to patients and clinicians the need to make decisions without evidence. Now, some people may have that high risk tolerance, but not everybody will. And that's why I think the dietary supplement example is so salient. Dietary supplements do not have to show safety and effectiveness, and so industry does not demonstrate that. That's not what people who are facing these terrible diseases need. The other challenge is when the standards are low and you allow products on the market that have not demonstrated that they are beneficial, it complicates the development of potentially better drugs because it makes it difficult to accrue those studies. And then you might also find yourself having to test new interventions against interventions that have not yet been proven to work. And so you can't quite tell, are patients benefiting from this new drug, or is it that neither of these drugs are beneficial? So you can entrench drugs that don't actually benefit patients. And so FDA has to account in its public health responsibilities, not only for the interests of patients today, but also the broader population of patients, which is why I'm encouraging the committee to draw on what we've heard about challenges to the expanded access pathway. I think that is the avenue that really does need to be improved and provides this balance, allowing patients today who have high risk tolerance to take unproven medicines while we continue to gather rigorous evidence. Unfortunately, patient registries are not going to get us there because they are not randomized, not controlled. They are not going to be able to answer these questions in the way that patients need to make autonomous, informed decisions about their treatment.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to turn to our closing statements now. I'll turn to Ranking Member Braun, and if he has to leave before mine is completed, I won't be offended.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been working on this for most of the 5 years I've been here in the Senate. And I come from a world where was in the logistics and distribution business, and it's frustrating sometimes when you want to get from here to there. I think we've had a really good discussion with it today, and we've heard, most importantly, from folks that are suffering through it. And I think if there's one lesson to learn, we need to have more of that, even on other diseases. Here, the urgency is even more compelling. This is a bipartisan effort. After much work, I think it's going to cascade into something quicker than what most bills take, since it took so long to get here. In the face of such cruel diseases, a more compassionate and flexible path has got to be there for patients. Why does Europe have such a pathway and we do not? I look forward to working with my colleagues to speed up access for individuals with these diseases while maintaining the gold standard of the FDA. We can do both at once. This is not a Republican or a Democrat discussion. This is a human discussion. We all have stories that are deeply personal, seeing firsthand the impact of how these diseases ravage not only the victims, the families as well. It's time for us to turn the passion into action, and we're going to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ranking Member Braun, thank you very much. As we've all heard today from patients and from family members who are desperately awaiting hope, awaiting a treatment, we've also heard today from patients who have lived their whole lives without any therapies for their condition. We've heard about, from the caregiver perspective, spouses, family members, a father who lost a daughter, hearing how hard it is to watch a family member suffer with no treatment options. We've also heard about the challenges that the drug companies face when working to bring a drug for a rare disease to market. We've heard about how to balance the unique challenges posed by rare diseases with regulatory processes that uphold, as Senator Braun said, the FDA's gold standard. We must continue the discussion with each other in the Senate, with the FDA, and all that have a stake in this, all the families who are represented here today. We've got to substantially improve the process for getting new drugs to patients while maintaining standards of efficacy and safety. So I want to thank all the witnesses today for their contributions, for the time they spent here, and for sharing very personal details about your lives. That is not easy to do in a public setting. And for the record, if any senators have additional questions for the witnesses or statements to be added, the hearing record will be kept open for 7 days until next Thursday, November the 2nd. Thank you all for participating in this hearing. This concludes our hearing.